In the last section, we spoke about the app that we're going to be building inside of this chapter, and we also cloned our starter repo and installed the dependencies. At the terminal, I already took the liberty of running npm start here, just to start our development server up. And as you can see, I've got it launched in my browser over here as well, and I see just React Simple Starter. Okay, so we spoke about a lot of what this app is going to do. In this section, let's plan out all the different React components that are going to form our application. So this is always a great step to take. Take the mockups that we have and say, all right, the search bar at the top is going to be its own component, and then the table is going to be its own component, so on and so on. So I took our mockup and I divided it up into a bunch of different sections to give us kind of a plan of how we're going to divide this application out. So at the very top, very simple one, is going to be the search bar. Search bar is just going to be responsible for showing the search input and a search button. Pretty simple component. It's also going to be responsible for kicking off calling an action creator in Redux. Whenever we enter a city name and then click on search and try to submit that search, it needs to have the ability to tell Redux like, hey, something just happened, you need to go fetch some data. Next, we've got the forecast list. And we might end up changing the name of it a little bit, but you can kind of just imagine that it's the general overall chart component here, the general overall table component. In previous sections, when we rendered lists, we had a list component and then kind of a list item component that represented a single row. This time, since the overall list is pretty simple, we're just going to combine the two into a single component. So one component that shows the overall table and knows how to render each of the line items inside of it as well. Third, we're going to have a separate chart component. So the chart, for each row that we make, we have 3 charts. We're not going to want to copy paste that code over and over for creating the chart. We want to just have a single straightforward chart component that we can pass our data to and have a reasonable expectation that, hey, I'm going to get a chart out of this thing. So this is starting to get into where we make truly reusable components that we can use even across projects if we want to, right? A chart like this, we could probably think of a couple dozen different apps that end up using a chart that look just like this. Finally, as before, we're going to have the overall application component. So the component that says okay, take the search bar, take the forecast list, and just render them onto page. So it's kind of like that glue component that ties everything together. All right, so we're going to end up referring back to this diagram a couple times. So I'm going to keep it up, but on a second monitor over here. Okay, so to get started, we're going to focus on that search bar. I'm going to open up my code editor here. And there we go. We got our source directory right there. So by working on the search bar, we need to first ask ourselves a quick question here. What does the search bar do? Is it going to be a component or a container? Remember, that's the first question we always need to ask ourselves. Well, as we were just discussing, the search bar needs to have the ability to modify the state of our application by dispatching actions, right? It needs to be able to call an action creator. It needs to say hey, someone just entered a search term, we need to make an API request. So it definitely needs to be able to talk to Redux, which means we definitely are going to want to make it a container, because a container has the ability to talk to Redux, whereas a normal component does not. A normal component just shows some content on the screen. That's all it does. So we'll get started by adding a new directory here inside of our source folder called containers. And then inside of it, we will make our search bar. So search bar JS. Then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and start scaffolding out our search bar. And we'll start nice and simple, just get something to show up on the screen. So at the top, we'll import React and our component from React. And then we'll export our default class search bar, which will extend component. And inside of here, we'll implement the default render method. And for right now, we're going to have it just show a form with a class name of input group. And then we'll just show a simple text input inside of that. The class name here is solely from Bootstrap CSS, which is already hooked up inside the boilerplate package. So this is just a class name that's coming over from Bootstrap here, nothing beyond that special to it. So this is a good enough start for us to actually just show something on the page, just to get something to render up. So I'm going to save this, and then we need to make sure that we actually insert this into our app component as well, so it can actually show up on the screen. So I'm going to flip over to app.js, which is inside of the components directory. And at the top, we will import search bar from, and we are inside of the components directory right now, so we're going to walk up to source, go into containers, and then get search bar. So we'll walk up, go into containers, and then we'll get search bar. And then instead of the silly little text that we have in here right now, we will just replace it with search bar. Okay. I'm going to flip over to my browser now, and we'll refresh the page. Just make sure everything is set up correctly. And it looks like we've got an input here, very good. So we're good to go on that end. Okay, so now that we know that we're showing the search bar correctly, let's do a little bit more work on it before we go on to the next section. The input in this case is not alone. It's not sitting by itself. We've also got the search button on here as well. So let's add a button on here and call it good for this section. So I'm going to add a span here. Again, we're going to make use of some built-in Bootstrap styling. So if you're ever curious about where these the structure of this HTML or the class names are coming from, you can always go and check out the Bootstrap documentation, which will tell you everything you could possibly want to know. In our case, we're going to have a span with a class name of input group button. And then that span is going to wrap a button of type submit with a class name of button space button secondary. We'll close the button, and inside of it we'll just have the text submit. Okay, so let's save this and refresh. And okay, this looks pretty good so far. Well, it doesn't look super good, but we've at least got our input and our button here as well. Let's go ahead and continue inside the next section.